Hey everybody, Ben Cotton here, and I wanted to do a quick video on how to get the most out of your blade grinder. If you're not grinding your own coffee, you should start right away. It's one of the easiest and cheapest ways to really make a huge leap in the quality of your coffee that you brew at home. And blade grinders get kind of a bad rap because people say, just get a burr grinder, they're much better, do a much better job, and that's very much true. The burr grinders do grind much better quality, more consistency. But the problem is, I can get a cheap blade grinder at a big box store like Walmart, Target, whatever, for maybe 20 bucks. And the Baratza Encore, which is probably the grinder, burr grinder that I would recommend to most people, is right around $130. That's about as cheap as you're going to want to go on a burr grinder, and so that's not the kind of money most people have just lying around. They can just use right away. They need to plan for that. So what I tell people all the time is, buy a cheap blade grinder. Even if you find one down at the thrift store, it doesn't matter. Get a cheap blade grinder. Grind your coffee less than a minute before you actually brew it, and then save your money up save up $130 or a little bit more than that for a Baratza Encore, Baratza Virtuoso, one of those. You'll never need another grinder. And so I'm going to show you today a couple of little, real simple, easy to do tips on using any blade grinder that'll help you get the most out of it until you can afford something better. So let's check that out. Okay, first, just let me mention, just so no one's confused, don't don't assume because I'm showing you this grinder that I like this grinder. I actually kind of hate it. That was actually fairly expensive for a blade grinder, but it's got just all kinds of features, timers and things, and all these pieces come apart, and it's just frustrating. The worst thing is the lid just pops open on its own, which can be obviously messy. But it's it's still a blade grinder, and they all work essentially the same way. So I want to show you a couple of the issues with every blade grinder that you can compensate for in a couple of ways. One of the big issues is that this blade spins around and it creates centrifugal force, which is going to throw your larger coffee particles to the outside of the grinding chamber on either side as it spins because they're heavier. And so what happens is the large pieces end up on the outside and they don't get ground very much, or at least as quickly. And then if you'll notice on the inside, all the smaller bits kind of stay in the middle, and they actually can get stuck underneath between the blade and the floor of the grinding chamber, and they just turn to dust. So what you end up with is dust and boulders. That's what I like. It's dust and boulders. You get the boulders, the large chunks of coffee on the outside that haven't really had much contact with the blade, and then you get these really, really finely ground pieces in the center. And the problem with that is that the small bits of coffee extract faster than the large pieces. So the large chunks of coffee that are in the bed of coffee in your brewer are going to extract the coffee flavor much slower than the smaller pieces. The smaller pieces will create, because they extract faster, you're going to get bitter coffee from the small pieces of coffee, the dust, and weak flavor, under-extracted flavor from the large chunks, which makes for a not great cup of coffee. So the more consistent the grind is, the better the coffee is going to be. So with a blade grinder, the complaint is always that you get inconsistent grind. The other problem is that as the blade turns, it turns so fast that it generates heat in the bed of coffee as it grinds, which is obviously pretty bad for flavor. It's going to cause the ground coffee to go stale almost immediately. And those things are overcome in burr grinders because burr grinders can control that. They limit the speed of the burrs, how fast they turn, so heat's not generated, and every particle of coffee gets ground to the same size. But these are things we can overcome in a couple of ways. Okay, so I'm just going to put some coffee in here to demonstrate a little bit. And the first thing you want to do is to just what's called pulse grinding, which is you don't just You can see why I don't like this thing. You don't just hold the button down and just wait for it to finish. You want to pulse the button so that speed doesn't build up on the blade and warm the coffee, but it also is going to allow the bed of coffee to settle between button presses, which will help keep the coffee from being, the heavy bits being slung out to the outside. So let me show you how I do that. You just do like this. Simple, very simple. And just keep doing that instead of just holding it down. As you do that, heat's building up and all the heavier pieces are being thrown into the outside. And so if I were to dump this out, you would find smaller pieces underneath the blade at the center and the larger chunks on the outside. The other thing you can do is after you pulse it a few times, take it and hold it and just shake it. Do it again. Give it a good shake. Just like that. Very, very simple and kind of obvious once you understand how these things work. The other thing that people often do is they over-grind the coffee, and it's a very common mistake. This is still a little coarse for a drip grind, but if your coffee is bitter, just don't grind it as long, don't grind it as coarse, and that will help solve that problem. If the coffee is under-extracted, grind it a little bit more fine. But if you do those two things, pulse the button instead of just holding it down, and also shake the grinder to mix up those grinds occasionally while you're grinding. Those two things will help make a much more consistent grind in your coffee. Hope that helps you guys out. And remember, if you can't be handsome, at least make good coffee.